I'm Casey Arriaga, and I am a clinician here at Windmill Wellness Ranch, which is the Drug and Alcohol Treatment Center. Where addiction comes from is actually a very complex question, so I'm going to give a simple answer first. And that's that addiction is basically, from a scientific perspective, it's a disorder in the part of our brain where we make choices. The natural question following that is, well then, what happens? How do we get that disorder? What happens in somebody's brain that leads to the horrible choices that addiction really turns out to be? And so that turns out to have a number of factors involved. The short answer is that there's biological factors, there's psychological factors, and there's environmental, or what they call social factors, which they combine and call the biopsychosocial model. And based on all of those things coming together, if you get sort of the wrong combination of things, addiction is sort of what naturally follows from that. So the parts of the brain that are most involved in addiction, primarily we look at an area called the limbic system. Now this is below the level of conscious thought. It's higher up in the order of the brain than the part that keeps you, say, just breathing and heartbeat, but it's still below the level of conscious thought, and that's important. The limbic system is there to help you survive. And so whatever it does, it thinks this is helping a person survive. The problem is the limbic system can't look forward more than about 45 seconds. So it does not consider consequences. It just says, I need what I need right now. You can imagine how this part, if it gets caught up in addiction, becomes very influential, because any signal it sends out into the rest of the brain says, this helps us survive, and there's a problem that you need to solve right now. I think of the limbic system in some ways as being kind of like a 2-year-old who's very loud, and you can't ignore them. And this part of our brain is where we generate emotions. It's where we help form memories and store them into long-term storage. And it is also, I'm going to kind of fudge a part in there called the nucleus accumbens, which has more to do with pleasure and how we experience pleasure. So pleasure tells us, here's a reward that we need. The emotional stuff, especially fear, tells us here's a threat we need to avoid. And the memory encoding tells us, let's remember which things are which. Where are the rewards? Where are the threats? What do I need to remember long term? What happens with addictive activity, and especially drugs of abuse, is they hijack that system. They either mimic the natural chemicals that are fueling that system, or they get us to dump more of those chemicals out, or they alter the way we receive those chemicals. No matter which system it's using or which mechanism it's using, it floods the system. And all of a sudden, the limbic area in our brain says, whatever you just did is the best survival move ever. Memorize that right now. So now you need to know for the rest of your life that this addictive activity or substance is your solution. The more you use that solution, the more the brain gets acclimated to it and starts to believe that it is not only the number one solution, but perhaps over time, the only solution. So if I'm feeling any emotional distress, I'm going to run to the bottle, I'm going to run to the needle, I'm going to run to the casino, wherever it is that I go to try and get that hit or that relief. So I often say that addiction does not start out as a problem. It starts out as a solution. So my brain says, in the limbic area, this is now my solution. This is where I need to go for answers. The more you do that, the more it gets reinforced, the harder it is to get out of that. And so other parts of the brain are definitely affected and get caught up in it, but the limbic system is what we kind of target as being the main area of the problem. So the way this affects somebody's conscious decisions becomes really insidious, because this part of the brain, since it's below the level of conscious thought, has a profound effect on how we make decisions, but we don't realize it. Our frontal lobe up here will tell us we made rational, logical decisions based on factors that we thought out, when in fact a lot of us make emotional decisions and then we rationalize them after the fact. And research shows that we'll make an emotional decision based on fear or pleasure or sadness or something like that, and then we will rationalize, make up rational reasons and logical reasons why we did it, and we will believe those reasons. So we can tell ourselves around addiction, you know what, I'm going to do this one more time, it's not going to be a big deal, the consequences won't apply this time, I'm justified in it, I deserve it. If you were me, you would understand, and we'll tell ourselves these things, and they will feel okay and kind of rational, and then we'll go right into the addictive behavior. And a lot of people have that experience where they'll do some of the addictive behavior. For instance, they'll do a drug, and sometimes directly afterwards fall into profound regret. How could I do this one more time? What's wrong with me? Well, what happened is the control in our brain just switched from one part to the other. The limbic system took over, said you need to do your addiction right now, and then as soon as it gets satisfied, then the frontal lobe kicks back in and says, what did we just do? We weren't going to do that anymore. And so our brain ends up being a tug of war between those two systems. So what makes addiction so appealing is the fact that this part of our brain that's so vital to our survival and influences how we make decisions, what makes it appealing is that that part of our brain thinks it's found the golden solution. And so it's gonna keep running back to that solution. So this is part of the cycle, is somebody gets into distress because of the addiction itself. And then the brain says the solution to distress is more of the addiction. Then the addiction causes more problems, so it becomes even more appealing to go back to what our brain has mistaken for survival. And that's what's so appealing about it, is our brain keeps thinking, this time it's gonna work out and I'm gonna be okay finally. So major risk factors, when we looked at that biopsychosocial model, biologically, major risk factors could be genetics. And again, there's not a single gene, but there are certain genes that we can actually start to look out for. Problem is, most people don't do genetic testing when they're kids to find out if they're at risk. And by the time we're teenagers, we no longer care, because teenagers are biologically set up to take more risk for less reward. But those genetics are a huge part. So there's genes that affect dopamine reception. There's genes that make us more prone to depression. There's genes that are going to affect how we metabolize certain chemicals. So for instance, someone that has genetics that allow them to metabolize alcohol better, which is to say it takes them longer to get drunk, longer to feel the effect, are actually at greater risk. You'd think they'd be at less risk because they don't get drunk as easily, but the fact is most of the time when we're teenagers, we're drinking to get drunk. So if it takes more alcohol to do that, we'll drink more alcohol. The more alcohol you drink, the more susceptible you are to falling into addiction to alcohol. Trauma can play a huge role in addiction. And part of the reason for that is because trauma can actually trigger some genetic risks that may not have otherwise expressed. And also trauma gives people often emotional distress and they don't know how to escape it. And so what will often happen is if somebody has gone through sufficient trauma, and again, that's going to depend from person to person what counts as sufficient trauma, but if it's enough for that person to tip them over the edge where maybe they weren't too vulnerable before, now they become more vulnerable, that person is going to find that even if they stop the chemical use or stop the addictive behavior, they're still going to have that underlying trauma waiting for them. In fact, often if they've been suppressing it with drug use or other addictive behavior, it's going to start to suddenly bubble up. And then they find themselves wanting to get away from the distress, which then makes the addiction more and more appealing. And again, the brain will tell itself logically, you know what, this will be okay this one time. Or it'll start making up excuses to kind of trick myself into going back into the addiction. And this is one of the big ways that people relapse. So luckily, this is not a hopeless situation. As I often say when I teach this in a class, if I was just going to teach you this much and say, sorry, everybody's hosed and send you home, that'd be a horrible class. I wouldn't even teach it. But luckily, there's a lot of things that can be done. So one of the biggest things that we can do first and foremost is we need to get a handle on the addiction itself and the addictive pattern. But we also have to know that just stopping is, for most people, not going to be enough. So we have that sort of two-phase approach. One is stop the addictive behavior. For that, recovery fellowships are really helpful. Some people can just sort of stop. They call it white knuckling, which is that idea that I'm holding on so tight that my knuckles turn white, but it's hard to sustain that over time. Going into treatment is a very popular option for good reason, because it separates you out from your normal environmental triggers, the people that you may have associated with that remind you to use. Sounds kind of a funny thing. Some people just roll out of bed. They roll out of bed, they put their slippers on, and the thought will come up, where's my next drug hit going to come from? Or where's my next drink going to come from? Treatment can kind of separate you from that. Some people will find that outpatient treatment is all they need, but they do need that sense of connection with other people who are trying to recover, and that's one of the biggest factors. In there also, we want to look and say, remember, two-phase approach. So we've stopped the use, that's great, but now what are we going to do about all those feelings that are going to come up? For some people, that's going to be underlying trauma or emotional issues they never dealt with. But one thing I like to say is that if you had zero trauma going into your addiction, you're probably going to have some by the time you get into recovery, because things will happen in the course of the addiction itself. Losses will have come up. We'll start feeling terrible about ourselves. How can I keep making those choices? And we need support for that. So for that, you're probably going to need some therapeutic support, which you can find to some extent within the recovery fellowships, but I'm a big fan of also talking to professionals who can walk you through some of that stuff, help you to start to let go of some of the guilt and the shame. So one of the things that I love about working at Windmill Wellness Ranch is that we have the luxury of being able to give people the time they need. Instead of saying this is going to be driven by a 3 to 4 week model, and a lot of people will go into treatment at a 28-day treatment center and find out that they only end up getting 21 days, really, when it comes out, and someone knocks on the door and says, hey, sorry, your insurance ran out, you got to go home now. And we don't approach it the same way. We work with people, we work with individuals, we work with families to give them the time and space they need. We also have an amazing therapeutic team who is more than willing to help people find those underlying causes that we were talking about. So we're able to give them the time, the space, and an environment in which they can do a much more thorough healing. So we offer things like ITMS, EMDR, NET, sounds like alphabet soup, but every one of these is a really powerful technique that can help people get to those underlying causes and conditions. So when they leave Windmill, they have a much better chance of staying sober long term and not just getting into a cycle of going in and out of treatment over and over again.